Vamos a dar inicio a estas jornadas con la ponencia o charla de Wendy Davies, que es profesora emérita de Historia en el University College London y es miembro asociado de la Facultad de Historia de la Universidad de Oxford. Se jubiló en el año 2007 y, a pesar de todo, sigue trabajando de una manera muy intensa, año hasta el cual impartió clases de historia medieval europea y ocupó diversos cargos administrativos. Ha trabajado sucesivamente en el país de Gales, en Bretaña y en Iberia sobre la Alta Edad Media. Ha dirigido proyectos interdisciplinares, algunos de ellos muy relevantes desde el punto de vista de los que nos dedicamos a esa tarea de unir el trabajo arqueológico con el trabajo procedente de las fuentes escritas. Y recientemente, bueno, la monografía más reciente es Windows of Justice in Northern Iberia, y la próxima monografía de publicación va a ser Gardens in Northern Iberia in the Early Middle Age, que es precisamente el tema que creo que va a tratar en esta comunicación. Y sin más, le cedo la palabra, muy honrada por abrir estas jornadas con su presencia, y bueno, disfrutaremos con la comunicación.
Gracias, Marga, and thank you to Juan Antonio for inviting me to speak. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I will begin with a very well-known case. On the 23rd of August, 956, Abbot Inigo of the monastery of San Martin made an agreement with 18 named and more unnamed people of Biarbascanes, near Burgos, that they could access the water channel he had bought the year before, in return for keeping the channel clear, though they could only take as much as would pass through the hole in a millstone, so that much. Significantly, the agreement was with a large group of local residents, and it was for them to use for their gardens, ad vestros ortos, as you see from the text, and other necessities. So since I have been working on gardens in the past few years, I thought I would look and see if there is any aspect of gardening that fits the main themes of this conference. So I am going to talk about these aspects. I'll say something by way of introduction about gardens in Northern Iberia in the early Middle Ages. Then I'll move on and say more about garden locations, then water supply and water management, ownership, and make a few conclusions. Garden cultivation was a distinctive kind of intensive cultivation, then as now, whether the gardens were large or small. Characteristically, it involved several kinds of cropping throughout the year, and requiring labor throughout the year, often quite hard labor. It was certainly recognized as distinctive by early medieval scribes in Northern Iberia, consistently differentiating gardens, ortos, from other kinds of land use, though there are regional differences in the frequency of references. There are many in Catalonia, very many in Castile, rather few in Galicia. And in order to arrive at this comment, I've basically used all pre-11th century charters from Northern Iberia, excluding Catalonia, and that amounts to about 2,600. And then I've taken a selection of Catalan cases from the counties of Pallars and Ribagorza in the west, Osona and Manresa east of Ceuta, and Barcelona County on the east coast. And those amount to 3,300. So I'm dealing with a total corpus of about 6,000 charters here. So the pie charts that you see there, the one on the left gives you proportions of the total number, the 6,000 charters studied by region. So you see already there are more from Catalonia than anywhere else, even with only a selection. And on the right-hand side, you see the number of charters with references to gardens by region as a percentage of total garden references. So you can see from that in dark blue, relatively few from Galicia, even from the Meseta, pale blue, relatively more from Castile, and lightish green, quite a lot more from Catalonia. The specific requirements of garden cultivation and the range of garden products were much discussed by Andalusi agronomists of the 10th and 11th centuries, but we can't find that sort of detail in Northern Iberian writing. Instead, we have to deduce what they grew from some occasional written references and from the much richer and increasing corpus of archaeobotanical evidence. And that's a map of the sites from which I have taken archaeobotanical material. And I have to thank Juan Antonio for providing the basis from which this map was produced. So you see, wide-ranging, north right to the center, east and west. The picture that emerges about product, garden product, is that fruit was consistently important. Apples, pears, cherries, plums, figs especially. There are lots of written references to fruit trees, not so much archaeobotany, but some. So fruit consistently, olives occasionally, but not so consistently as the other fruits. And also legumes. Those are Catarina's beans in the top right-hand corner. So beans, peas, lentils, grass peas, and bitter vetch. In some parts, the range of product was wider, Catalonia and northern Portugal especially, and in some parts, textile fibers and dye plants are also an element, but they're much more difficult to detect. What we do not find, I have to emphasize, are ornamental flowers. There is absolutely no evidence that people were using gardens to decorate things. They're productive, functional. Garden space was clearly desirable in the later 9th and 10th centuries, as we have many records of garden transactions. People buying gardens were noticeable on the Meseta and in Catalonia especially. I'm sorry, I haven't got the Catalan plot on this chart, but the important things for you to take is to compare Castile and the Meseta, so that you see there's much more gardens acquired by gift in Castile than on the Meseta, whereas on the Meseta to the west of Castile, there's much more acquiring gardens by buying them. I do, however, think that where gift is significant, religious bodies in particular were negotiating in order to get gifts. So it's just a different way of acquiring a garden. Overall, there were many acquisitions of gardens by monasteries, whether by gift or sale, in the second half of the 10th century. So that's here to show you the contrast between the most of Northern Iberia pattern and the Catalan pattern. So at the top, on the left, there are the beneficiaries of transactions in gardens, so who gets a garden after a gift or a sale. And you see in most of Northern Iberia, it is overwhelmingly religious parties. Whereas in Catalonia, although the majority of acquirers are religious, there are significant numbers of aristocrats, peasants, and middling people. And at the bottom, there's just a breakdown of what kind of religious beneficiary acquired. So again, on the left, in most of Northern Iberia, it's overwhelmingly monasteries with a few priests, bishops, and so on. Whereas in Catalonia, it is still majority monasteries, but deacons, for example, are quite significant acquirers of gardens. So that's just a rather brief introduction in general about gardens. I'll say more now about garden locations. Textual evidence of garden location indicates that gardens could be found in many kinds of location, beside houses, in towns, among arable plots, isolated in a landscape of mixed land use. For example, one garden in Barcelona County had a river on two sides and the arable of two different owners on two sides. But there were also garden zones, areas with lots of gardens, often in the Vegas. So these gardens were bounded exclusively by other gardens. So these occur, for example, outside Zamora on the River Duero, outside the east gate of León, or in the interfluvium south of León, near Bribiesca in Castile, in Oyic in Catalonia, in southern Osona, and best evidenced of all, because it was very large, outside the northeast gate of Barcelona. We need to think of these zones, if you know England at all, like allotments in England, perhaps like huertas in Spain, but probably not as big as the huertas of the late Middle Ages. Many of these zones, you will note, were on watercourses, and the Via Bascones case should remind us that all gardens need water. Reliable water supply is essential for successful cultivation. So quite apart from garden zones, there are dozens and dozens of explicit references to gardens that lay on watercourses, on great rivers like the Toria, the Esla, the Duero, the Llobregat, and on smaller streams. And in fact, for Catalonia, the wonderful set of Carolingian atlases produced by Bolos and Hurtado have maps mapping land use. And I don't know if you can see, H on this map is for garden, huerto. I just put a ring around an area where, in a valley where you've got a lot of H's. Gardens also lay beside mills and on mill streams. Mill and garden often went together, obviously, because the water to power a mill could also be used for watering plants. Although in the charter that records the original sale of water to the Via Bascones monastery a year before the concession to locals, the water was either for milling or for gardening. So here are just lots of examples. I think I won't go through them in detail. It's unnecessary detail from your point of view. But there are lots of different examples of gifts or sales of mills plus its garden, the garden going with the mill. Interpreting archaeological evidence of location is much, much trickier than simply using the texts. As Alfonso Vigil pointed out, archaeologically, gardens are very difficult to find, though there are a few early suggestions from the Madrid region that qualify, many of which were dug 20 or so years ago by Alfonso. So, for example, at the 6th to 8th century settlement of El Pelicano, plots were spaced out along the Los Combos stream. Or the wide-mouthed waterholes by the 6th to 9th century settlement of La Indiana, aligned at 10 to 12 meter intervals, look as if they were intended to serve gardens. And the so-called near rectangular planting plots of Gothkev, a 6th to 8th century settlement of 10 to 12 households, are as close as we can get to a house and garden model. I mean, these are big, as you see, very big. Some people think far too big to call a garden. But actually, we do have measurements of some Catalan gardens, and the largest of those are comparable with these. So, for my money, this is the closest that you can get archaeologically to a garden. However, importantly, although some gardens lay beside houses like this, and some formed part of a house-yard-garden unit, casa, corte, orto, especially in Catalonia, we don't have to restrict ourselves to looking for plots like that. There are other kinds of indicator of intensive cultivation. And intensive cultivation, as many archaeobotanists have said, is garden cultivation. So we have manuring scatters round settlements. We have areas of dark hearth in old Roman towns, Leon and Barcelona in particular, but probably also Braga and Astorga. We have other kinds of evidence of fertilization with vegetable or green or animal manure. We have the weeds. We have functional weed ecology. The weeds that are associated with intensive cultivation are different from the weeds that are associated with extensive cultivation. So, for example, I'm sorry, the bracket has slipped there. The goosefoot in the top right-hand corner, that's a Canopodiatea weed. So that's associated with intensive, with garden cultivation, whereas the ryegrass, Lolium temulentum, at the bottom right, is Secalitea, which is associated with extensive, so arable fields, for example. As you know, ryegrass tends to grow with wheat. And on the left, there's one of Amy Bogart's many plots of the different distribution of the Canopodiatea and the Secaliatea. So functional weed ecology is extremely difficult to apply, but actually there have been some very good Spanish excavations which have produced good weed results. For example, the ditch, it's a nice, clear example. The ditch around the first wall of Santiago produces Canopodiatea, so intensive weed cultivation weeds, intensive cultivation weeds. So that is also a useful indicator of garden practice. And also, of course, we shouldn't forget terracing. There is a lot of evidence of the construction of terraces from early in the Middle Ages. The best known are the set of terraces, several sets of terraces, outside Santiago, southeast of the city centre, a series which may have begun in the 6th century, but was clearly in operation before the 10th century, with, in that case, good evidence of fertilization. There are plenty more at Samos, also in Galicia, at Melque, in the center, in the first pre-Islamic phase, at Santo Adriano in Asturias, several sites in the Basque Country, here outside Vitoria, in the second, late 10th century phase, also well fertilized, at Zabaya and Thornothegi, some of which are extremely big and were probably for cereal cultivation. But there are also much narrower ones at Thornothegi. And more recently at Torontejo, the earliest dated to the late 7th century. In view of the fertilization of so many, including spreading with domestic waste, I can envisage that scribes who had been writing about them would have described those, particularly the narrower ones, as ortos, as gardens. So now let me move to water management. The locations I stressed were those of gardens on watercourses. A lot of water supply obviously came directly from rivers and streams. Management was often controlling rights to draw water from the river. So, for example, in the Onthena Valley, I've given you the Google Earth picture just to stress how small the Onthena stream is. The monastery of Baldabimbre was given rights to draw water from the Onthema stream for 2.5 days a week, so not permanently, in 978. And it had an obligation to allow the poor water for irrigation, pro rigare, on Sundays, just on Sundays, not every day, very limited water supply for the poor. But as well as taking water directly from rivers and streams, there were dedicated water channels cut to supply gardens. The Biabascanes case implies that a channel had been cut from the river Arlanthon. But there are also plenty of explicit references to water channels serving gardens. So here's just a selection, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens of these. So in 912 in Galicia, for the monastery of San Martin Pinario, they were given 2 parts of a river and a water channel, a half for the cloister and a half to water their gardens. Or in 925, a small group of locals, and I'll come back to these, led by a man called Bertute, 6 of whom were named, gave the Bishop of Leon water rights across their land, water plus channel to the river Torio, and in return, they had rights to continue to draw water for their garden. Or in 940, there's sale of a garden and apple trees and a water channel. That's the 3rd example down there. You see et suo aqueducto, and its water channel. The water channel goes with the garden. Or 955, the channel Regum, I didn't pick that out in red, leading to the gardens and flax fields of Marialba, which were given to Abayar. Or the dozens and dozens of gardens and water channels which changed hands in Catalonia, a garden and water channel given by a widow and her son to the monastery of Saint Cugat, garden and its water channel sold to the Bishop of Angers in 989, another sold to a layman in 997, and many more. So transactions in separate gardens were often for the garden plus its water channel, suo rego or suo aqueducto. The property unit is garden plus water channel. Channels are integral to the property. So that means these gardens are irrigated. Don't imagine great elaborate irrigation systems such as develop in Al-Andalus. These are smaller, simple channels, but it is irrigation. And plenty of evidence, as you saw from my examples, from early in the 10th century. If there were no rivers from which, or streams from which to cut a channel, there were wells. And so we also find gardens together with their wells. So, for example, an enclosed garden plus well in Sayantho, sold to Abayar in 942, or the 2 examples I've given here, which both relate to the huge garden zone outside the gate of Barcelona. So a garden and its well in that garden zone, sold by a woman to a layman in 980, or a garden beside a well given to a Barcelona church in 997. So that then leaves me to talk about ownership, a very high proportion of references to garden water channels treat them as private property. The garden unit, including its water, was owned and sold or given away by a peasant couple or a widow or her children or two brothers. Purchasers could be other peasant groups, though they were also, as I've already indicated, bishops, churches, and especially monasteries, corporate owners. I just remind you of that. Of course, aristocrats owned and dealt in water channels too, but their gardens tended to be part of larger properties with very mixed land use. So it's not as easy to focus on the specifics of the garden when dealing with those transactions. I have, in the book I've written, dealt with them, but I'm not talking about those here. So, of course, aristocrats are activating too. There were therefore many individual and particularly family interests rather than collective interests in the ownership of water channel. There is, in fact, a nice charter from Ribagortha. It's a consecration charter. It records the foundation of the Church of Saint Pere de Molins, and together with the foundation of that church, there are recorded many gifts of small properties by local people. Those small gifts include 4 sets of people giving different portions of the river. And I just snapped in the top left the relevant bit of the very long charter. Aureolus and his fratres and nepotes gave one bit. Miro and his fratres and nepotes gave another bit. Borellus and Galindo and his nepotes another. Undisculus and his brother. 4 different family groups had separate rights measured from one point to another along the river bank. So garden management and control of the water supply was often a private family affair. Similarly, the wells, where we have gardens with wells, were on private, usually family property. On the other hand, we can also see small groups negotiating. Beatute and his 5 named companions I mentioned before, negotiating with the Bishop of Leon in 925. It's a quite small group, so it could have been a family group. But actually, I don't think it was, because the text does not imply any family connection between those 6 people. And usually, you can tell from the way texts describe it if it's family. So I would rather see them as a group of local residents working together in order to negotiate with the bishop and get some continued access to their water. Or you may have noticed in the example I gave before of the Marialba gardens and the channel which led to the Marialba gardens and flax fields. They were the gardens and flax fields of the Marialba Concilio, and in that case, we can debate the meaning of concilio here, but certainly a large group of local people were controlling those gardens and flax fields. And of course, the Biabascanes case with which I began named a much larger local group of 18 and others unnamed. Perhaps in that case, the whole community of local residents. So that might well remind us of some well-known cases of dispute over water rights, like the occasion when people came from 5, sorry, I think that's the wrong one. Yeah, from 5 settlements along the river Arlanzón, from Burgos to Castañares, a distance of about 6 kilometers. Those people from 5 settlements came together in 932 in court when the abbot of San Torquato claimed access to water in the channel from Burgos to Castañares. A later charter tells us that the monastery wanted it for watering its gardens. So here there's also a large group of locals. 23 are named and many more are indicated. And a dispute with the locals is implied by the charter, although in fact the text is ambiguous, though I note the most recent editor thinks there was a dispute. Clearly, as so often is the case, the abbot won. In a court case in Catalonia in 938, no fewer than 111 local people were named. They gave evidence that a large property, this property of Artes, with mixed land use, including gardens and watercourses. This comes again from one of the remarkable atlases. And if you look at the northeastern and southern boundaries, there are a lot of points marked there on the map. That's all of the points of a very long perambulation that is cited in the charter. Absolutely extraordinary piece of reconstruction. But 111 local people were interrogated about the land use, including the gardens and watercourses, and they were asked if it had been given to the Bishop of Vic, and they testified that it had been given to the Bishop of Vic, and they were therefore his tenants, since they lived there. In another Catalan court case in 996, over who had control over a stretch of water running from the river Sherkavins, 21 locals were asked who in the past had used the water to water their gardens, quales hortos irrigaverant, and run their mills, and answered that for 30 years it had been the monastery of Sant Cugat. A big group of locals here, in effect determining who controlled the water supply. So, as seigneurial interests were established, larger and larger groups of local people became involved in confirming or contesting or exercising water rights for several purposes, but definitely for watering gardens. So, for example, in 954, the Count of Barcelona gave 15 named people land in Freysia so that they could build houses and make gardens, and also, together, in common, build a tower. So, to conclude, churches, bishops, and especially monasteries acquired gardens, and so did some lay landlords, by donation and purchase. With gardens, they often acquired the essential water supply, or they negotiated separately for the water. But they could conflict with local people over access to water. In a situation of conflict, whatever their original private rights, local people came together, especially when dams were constructed to divert water. And you might remember another famous case of Gondomaro, south of Leon, who, with his local group, was involved in conflict, again with the monastery of Valdebimbre. Not surprising if powerful landlords are constructing dams, not surprising that it would affect everybody. It's not a lot of use having family rights to a stretch of water if a lordly proprietor was diverting the water. So, seigneurial action, some for mills, of course, but gardens too, was both a threat to local residents, but also a stimulus to local collaboration. Seigneurial action in respect of water rights must actually have reduced local access. In the Beer Baskenes case, the locals by agreement only have as much water as would pass through the hole in a millstone, that much. It's a trickle of water. And those poor in Onthina who were allowed water on Sundays could only, for irrigation, could only get it on Sundays. We might say then that water supply for gardens was largely a private matter for individual families, but increasingly across the 10th century, monastic and seigneurial acquisition of gardens and water channels threatened family control and stimulated collective action. That collective action, as we all know, appears to have thrown up local leaders, the people who are named first. And you can make a case for increasing social differentiation in respect of this gardens and water management area. I could make the case in Catalonia, though I couldn't do it elsewhere, because you can see upwardly mobile people. Sorry, that's not the right slide, but never mind. You can see upwardly mobile people becoming people of middling status by buying gardens and water channels in Catalonia. So these are simple and really very obvious points. Monastic acquisition of gardens especially diverted gardens from peasant proprietors to monastic owners across Northern Iberia, because it was peasant sale to monasteries, particularly in the second half of the 10th century, that drove that trend. I'm sorry, the colours have come out differently on these two, but the top one shows you who is selling gardens in most of Northern Iberia, and the dark green line are peasant vendors of gardens, and the bottom one shows you sale of individual gardens in Catalonia by status, and the top blue line are peasant vendors of gardens. So it is peasants who are alienating gardens. Perhaps peasants sold gardens because they lost control of the water supply. A thought I only had yesterday while writing an email to Iñaki, which I did not include as a possible explanation in my book. So garden cultivation and garden space were distinctive and significant. I hope we can all keep that in mind when analysing land use and the product of the land. And if you don't mind, I'll just end with a small plug for my book, in which I explore these and other questions, and it ought to be out by Christmas. Thank you.